Japan has been in the news a lot recently, and I've heard so many bad takes about how they broke their own economy and the US had to save them. That is wrong. China broke Japan. This all started in November last year with a single statement from the Japanese Prime Minister which put Japan into an economic war with China that it was never going to win. But Japan was never really the target. This is China against America, and Japan is just where they are fighting it. And ultimately, it's America and the entire Western world who suffers the consequences if they lose. So if you've got a pension, a mortgage, or money in the stock market, this involves you. You just haven't been told yet. Let's figure this out together. First, we need to understand how a country borrows money. When a government needs money, it borrows it from investors. You hand over cash, they hand you an IOU. They pay you interest every year and give back the initial investment at the end of the term. The interest rate on that IOU is the yield, and it's set not by the government, but by the people lending the money. If there's a lot of lenders, Japan pays next to nothing. If the lenders thin out, then it has to offer more interest to attract them. And for 30 years, Japan has paid next to zero interest. But who lends to the government at 0%? Why would you give them your money? Well, that's the thing. No one really did. Mostly, who was buying their debt was their own central bank. For years, they printed money and lent it to themselves, actually trying to create inflation and drag Japan out of 30 years of falling prices, deflation. That's the opposite problem to what most of the West has, where we have crazy inflation. But that created another problem. Now half of Japan's debt is owed to Japan itself. They owe themselves money. Also, if you can borrow at 0%, it's basically free money. When you want to buy a house, you're limited by how much you can afford to pay per month on your mortgage. So maybe you could afford to borrow, let's say, $300,000 at 4% interest. But if you have 0% interest, why buy a $300K house? You may as well buy a $2 million mansion. A mansion's $2 million these days, they're probably more expensive. That's how old I am. Anyway, that's how Japan ended up with more debt than any other rich country on earth, over 200% of their GDP. Then it ended. In June, the Bank of Japan put rates up to 1% for the first time since 1995. So you've got your $2 million mansion, your rate resets, and all of a sudden you're paying $20K a year in interest. Not a good situation, but that is the situation Japan is in right now, and China is making it worse for them. Now, if you've seen anything about Japan lately, you've heard the explanation, and it's always the same one. Sanae Takaichi, that's the Japanese Prime Minister. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. She won in a landslide in February, and people say she is spending too much. She's got a $2.3 trillion investment plan. She's borrowing like the last 30 years never happened to Japan. And all of that is true. She is spending enormous amounts of money, but nobody stops to ask the obvious question. Why is she spending it? Governments don't just triple their defense budget, strengthen supply chains, and stockpile minerals for fun. They do it when somebody is squeezing them. Japan is not spending because it wants to. It's spending because China has spent 10 months systematically dismantling them. Quick thing before you go, I've written a free guide called How to Retire Before 2036. It's a full 10-year plan for anyone starting late. Get out of debt, invest properly, retire on time. Free download, link in the description.